Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. This is the second of a two-part episode featuring the queer, disabled, non-binary femme writer and cultural worker, Leah Lakshmi Piepzna-Samarasinha. As I explained in the last episode, my interview with Leah was so flippin' fantastic that it ran for several hours. And rather than try to cram all of that goodness into a single episode, which is a bit overwhelming for a podcast size, we decided to split the episode in two. So this is episode 62, and it features the second part of that interview. If you haven't already listened to episode 61 with the first part of the interview, I highly recommend you stop this episode now, go back to episode 61, catch up on that first part of the interview, and then come back here so you're all caught up for today's conversation. In this second part of our interview, Leah and I chat about the past successes and current challenges of the disability justice movement, how to create truly accessible performance and art spaces, and why helping survivors remake the world is how Leah imagines otherwise. So you brought up your work with Sins Invalid, with Mangoes with Chili, and particularly your longstanding work in disability justice movement. So I'd love to kind of shift gears a little bit to talk about your work in those movements and maybe how it spurred your forthcoming book, which I'm very excited is coming out in the fall, right?
Yeah, it's coming out. So right as of right now, it's called Care Work, Dreaming Disability Justice Culture, and it's coming out on Arsenal Pulp Press in October of 2018, and I'm super excited.
Perhaps just to start off, so for those of listeners who aren't familiar with that term or maybe aren't familiar with its difference from a disability rights framework, how do you define disability justice?
The term was created by 5 people in 2005 who were part of a group called the Disability Justice Collective. And they're Patty Byrne, Leroy Moore, Mia Mingus, Eli Clare, and Sebastian Margaret. And these were disabled Black folks, disabled Asian folks, disabled queer Black and Asian folks, and like white, queer, and trans working class disabled folks. Disability justice was created by intersectional disabled queer folks who were really sick of the single issue white narrative and politics of the disability rights movement. Giving disability rights its due, being like, hey, we're not saying we're not grateful for the Americans with Disabilities Act or, 80s, 70s disability rights activism for sure. But I often say, like, disability justice is a disability rights as environmental justice is the environmental rights movement. Environmental justice was founded by Black, Indigenous, and Brown people who cared about the environment, but are like, look, it's not just about white people saving trees. It's about, like, being Native and having a uranium mine on your sacred land. It's about being Black and, like, everyone in your neighborhood in West Oakland has asthma. It's about taking an intersectional perspective. I want to quote Patty Byrne, who's the co-founder with Leroy Moore of Sins Invalid and is the writer of Skin, Tooth, and Bone, The Basis of Our Movement is People, a Disability Justice Primer, which just came out this past year and which I really encourage people to check out. Patty says, disability justice centers the lives and leadership of people of color, of queer and gender nonconforming people with disabilities. It is, and this is all in caps, it is a movement-building framework, not an academic theory. When people invisibilize the leadership of people of color, of queer and gender nonconforming people with disabilities, it's not disability justice. It's interesting to me when you were like longstanding involvement with disability justice, I'm like, oh my God, that's part of where we're at. Like disability justice as a term was coined in 2005. We're now in 2018. It's been 13 years. And something I'll say that I think maybe we can come back to later a little bit more is like, I feel like I've seen so many changes since I got involved. And I also am like, we've been around for 13 years and a lot of people are still at being like, disability justice, what's that? Disabled people? What? Ableism? What is that? So in terms of how I get involved, I wanted to share some personal story and then maybe I'll jump back out to some more theory and framework. So I've been disabled since 1997. I was born in 75 and I've been neurodivergent since I was born. And I've been active as a creative writer since the late 90s. And I didn't start creating and performing and publishing work about disability till 2009. Not really. And the reason for that is that although in the 90s I was involved in movements that predate disability justice, but, did have leadership and, movement creation by disabled people of color. I'm thinking specifically of the psychiatric survivor movement in Toronto, which is a movement of people who, there's all kinds of words, but who identify as mentally ill, mad, as psychiatric survivors, who are organizing, around the conditions of our lives. I was very much in a place when it came to chronic illness where the disabled people I saw in Toronto in the 2000s were white. They were all white. And I had disabled people of color friends, but, it was like a secret. Like, we were all disabled queer people with disabilities, but we'd be like, oh my God, you have fibromyalgia too? Me too. Oh my God, I don't talk about it to anybody. And there was so much shame. There wasn't a movement or a cultural or any kind of space to speak about our experiences as disabled people of color. It just wasn't there. So my entry point into disability justice was I moved to Oakland in 2007. I came back to the States to go to grad school and to be in Oakland and to be in QPOC artist community. And right before I left, I had actually connected with Laurie Erickson, who's a white disabled queer femme in Toronto, who's really amazing. And, she had kind of like introduced me to her disabled queer arts and political community. And I was like, oh my God, this is mind blowing. But they were all white. Pretty much everyone I met was white. And I was like, God, should I leave? They're disabled. But then I was like, oh, but there's all this cutie pot community in Oakland. Okay, I guess I'm going there. For the first couple of years I was in the Bay, I really didn't talk about disability because there was like California sunshine and cheap organic vegetables. Like, I actually had less pain than I'd had for a couple of years. I really passed to a certain degree as able-bodied. Like, I was in this like Oakland paradise of like all these queer and trans POC collective houses and art and clubs. And it was such a fun time. And I was kind of having a second adolescence in a way. My abusive partner wasn't there. It was sunny. There was the ocean. There's all this good food and art. And I was just like, yeah. And most of my friends really identified as able-bodied. And I was like, I just want to keep up. I don't want to talk about this. And then in 2008, I saw promotion for Sins and Ballads 2008 show, and I bought a ticket, and I didn't tell any one of my friends I was going, and I went by myself. And even before I saw the show, I was blown away because as disabled queer people of color cultural producers, it's about what we create on the stage, but it's also about that temporary universe that the 2 hours that you're all in the theater is. And what I mean by that is that the first time I went to a Sins show, I walked in, with my cane. And I wasn't the only cane user. There was like 40 cane users, and they were like black, brown, white, queer, trans. And then there wasn't one person in a wheelchair. There was like 30 people in wheelchairs and scooters and adaptive equipment. And there was a whole bunch of people signing. And there were a whole bunch of people where I was like, oh my God, you've got pain face. I know what pain face is. I have that face. There were a lot of people who were neurodivergent, who were looking anxious or looking psychically different. There were people with lots of different bodies. There were people who were amputees. There was this whole range of disabled and chronically ill and crazy universe and deaf universe. And it was a very black, brown, queer, trans, sexy, dressed up for the show universe. And as somebody who, like so many people, had felt like I have to closet my disability, I have to hide it, I have to apologize for it. It's just this big embarrassing thing. And if I want everyone to accept me and if I want to have a career, I've just got to take care of it on a corner on my own and not bother anyone with it. Just the experience of being in this black and brown queer disabled universe that was sexy and full of pleasure and full of people relating to each other was a revelation. And then the show started, and part of the opening of the show is Rodney Bell, who's a wheelchair-using dancer and Maori artist, being slowly suspended 40 feet above the stage as Patty's voice comes on and says, "Is this safe? Are you safe? Are you sufficiently insulated from us, the deviant, the disabled, the deaf, the non-normative? Or are you afraid that you'll become stained by our leaking needs?" And she goes on and just created this 2-minute performance piece where she's talking about all of the ways in which eugenics and ableist colonial racism and non-disabled fear of disabled black and brown bodies and the ways that we are institutionalized and pushed away and out of society affect us. And then she comes back to talk about desire and about coming home to disabled black and brown queer bodies. And I was crying. And I was like, I've never seen anything like this. I just got brought in. My life has changed. a few years later, when I had been invited to be a part of SINS, I remember having a conversation with Patty. I was newly as a member of SINS, and people were like, "Oh, you're in SINS Invalid. What is that?" And I'd be like, "Well, we're a disability justice collective of disabled, queer and trans, Black and brown people doing performance art about sex." And there'd be this like really long pause a lot of the time where people would not know what to say. And sometimes people would be like, "Oh, that's so wonderful." And sometimes people would be like, "Oh, there's enough material about disabled people of color and sex for a whole show," like really earnestly. And then sometimes people would be like, "Why performance art?" So I remember asking Patty, I was like, "Okay, you're trying to advance disability justice. Why did you choose performance art?" Like other people would have been like, "Let's do a workshop." And I really clearly remember her looking at me and kind of laughing under her breath and being like, "Leah, I could talk to disabled white people and try and get them not to be racist till I'm blue in the face. And I could try," and she's like, "and I could do a million workshops to able-bodied, radical people of color, trying to educate them about ableism and trying to get them to like care about us." And she's like, "and I've done that too." But she's like, "Or I could do a 3-minute piece of performance art that just really gets in people's heads and gets in all of their dreams and nightmares and unspoken thoughts about disability and racism and ableism. And I could just fuck their shit up." And she's like, "I'm going to do that one." And SINS has also done so much like workshops and political organizing and tool creating around like, here's how you make a radically cross-ability accessible political action. Here's access suggestions for a show or a cultural event. And we've also kept the artistry and the performance art at the center as a form of doing cultural activism, as a way of fucking people's shit up about ableism. And I would say we're doing that for people who are abled, for people who are disabled, chronically ill, deaf, neurodivergent, and also for people who are in the middle area where they're like, "Wait, I'm disabled. Oh my God, I'm disabled. Oh my God, my mom's a polio survivor. Oh my God. Oh my God, disability is all in my life. I'm up in it." Yeah, so that's some of my entry point. So I watched the show. I had my mind blown. And then around a year later, SINS did an open call for new performers, and I sent in some stuff and they asked me to join them. And I've been performing with them ever since. And it's been such a learning curve from the first show I was in, where I was so used to being in queer and trans people of color, non-disability specific art spaces where it's like, we have no money, we have no resources. Okay, we got the queer club for one night. So show up an hour before, we're going to do all the tech. Yes, it's inaccessible and it's up 2 flights of stairs, but this is what we have. We're just going to make do and do the show. And if you're sick or having a panic attack or you can't get up the stairs, well, too bad. That was my experience, and, a lot of it. And then with SINS, Patty was like, "Okay, so book off the whole week because we do a tech week because we're disabled and Accessoride is going to break down or not show up and someone's going to get sick and someone's going to have a panic attack." And I was like, oh my God, this is what it is to do cultural activism and political activism where disability is not an afterthought. It's actually at the center from the beginning. The very first day that, of Tech Week, she was like, "Okay, we're going to do an access check-in." And I was like, "What's that?" Everybody in this incredibly mixed disability group went around, and all of these like more seasoned disabled artists, said without shame, "Okay, here's what I need to be present in the space." And my jaw was just dropped. And when it came to my turn, I was like, I have fibro and I need a chair, but I don't really need anything. I'm fine. But then as people kept going around and without shame, and also not coming from a sense of entitlement, which I think a lot of times when people hear people who are new to disability justice as a framework or who aren't disabled or both see someone making an access request, they get their backs up and they think it's coming from a place of like being some kind of snob or some kind of princess who thinks you're entitled to everything. And that's not where people were coming from. People were just like, "I'm disabled. I've got a right to be here. And I need a chair. I need you to not stand in the way of my interpreter when they're interpreting for me. I need you to speak to me, not to my interpreter. I'm going to be lying down in a corner being kind of weird. Don't mind me. That's what I need to do. I really need people to be fragrance free for real. I need to empty my gray bag every hour. Please don't look at me while I do that, but you can talk to me." Later on after the show was over, I remember a couple of people coming up to me and being like, "That's the most present you've ever been as a performer that I've seen you." And I was like, yeah, it's because my whole body got to show up without shame. And not immediately. It's not like I just saw that and I was like, "Oh, I'm not ashamed anymore." And that's the thing, too. I think sometimes people who are kind of dipping their toe in disability justice are like, oh, all you people who don't have any shame. And I'm like, no, I mean, people I know who've been doing this work for 40 years still wrestle with shame and still wrestle with self-love. And it is an ongoing process, an ongoing political process to love yourself as a disabled, intersectional person of color, for sure. But that space created the cultural container where I was able to start doing it. And what I said at the beginning of answering your question, where I was like, I never written about disability in my life really before Sins. Culture creates culture. Back when I was starting as an artist, and there was a period of time where really it felt in Toronto like there was straight and homophobic people of color art space on the one hand and white, racist, queer art space on the other. In order for my writing to have the audience that it needed to have, and for me to be able to do it, I needed to come together with other people and make queer and trans people of color art space. And similarly, in order to create intersectional disabled art, as a queer femme of color, I needed Sins, and I needed the cultural labor of Patty and Leroy and so many other people to create that container where I'm like, oh, I can tell the story and it won't be received with silence or, oh, poor you, or that's so inspirational. Creating space to tell disability justice stories and telling disability justice stories is a way that we remake the world. And it's a way that we do disability justice activism, because we are creating space to show different ways to be disabled, sick, neurodivergent, and deaf people of color. We are creating space for other disabled Black and brown queer folks to be like, oh my God, that's my story, or that's part of my story, and I can tell it, and I can ask for what I need, and I can create the movements that are going to save my life, that aren't going to leave me behind.
What are some of the disability justice organizations or projects that you're really excited about right now?
Deaf Poets Society is an incredible deaf and disabled literary space online. The Harriet Tubman Collective is really important. It's a collective of Black, disabled, and neurodivergent folks. They're doing incredible work. And one thing I know that they have talked about in their manifesto is they've really named, they're like, yeah, we're named the Harriet Tubman Collective because Harriet Tubman was a disabled Black abolitionist, feminist freedom fighter. And in their first statement, one thing they called on was they were like, hey, Movement for Black Lives, there's ways in which ableism and disabled Black people are marginalized within the Movement for Black Lives. We need to change this. That's not my movement space, but that's a movement space that I want to name and bring in. And then creating Collective Access, which was a space I was part of creating with other disabled folks of color in Detroit at the Allied Media Conference and at the United States Social Forum in 2010, where as disabled people of color who were all about to go to this big ass, giant, semi-accessible, not really social justice space, we were all like, oh my God, there's not going to be any access. We're going to die. And then we were like, what if instead of kind of like tugging on the sleeve of the organizers, we're going to do that too, and we're going to call for access on a mass scale. But what if we create a group where, as much as we can, other sick and disabled folks find each other and we figure out ways to do mutual aid to each other?
It sounds like just in your own personal experience with the disability justice movement, you've outlined so many tremendous gains and transformations that the movement itself has produced. And those extend beyond your personal involvement, obviously, as well. I'm curious about challenges or maybe things you're excited to tackle for the future with regards to the disability justice movement.
First, I want to say, success-wise, I think that disability justice has grown beyond, I think, a lot of people's wildest dreams. I think some of the successes are that there are a lot more disabled Black, Indigenous, and brown people who are finding each other, claiming disability as a space of organizing, as a cultural and political community. When I look at the number of people who are in a jam and who are like, I need someone to give money to my Indiegogo for medical costs, or I need people to bring me soup, or here's the meal train. I think about when I was disabled in the 90s, and not only did those pieces of technology not exist, but when I was sick, my political collective was just like, oh, you can't do the mailing? Well, too bad. And really the only person who helped me out with food was my abusive partner. I'm not saying that we're out of the woods and that kind of dynamic doesn't happen, but I see so much more of it being a cultural norm in social justice communities and other spaces where people help each other and are like, everyone throws in $5 to this fundraiser. Okay, so-and-so's sick. Who's bringing the soup this week? I think there is so much more understanding that especially as systems fail us and as the government is bankrupt, that like we just have each other to care for each other. And I think that people are really doing a lot of experimentations in how creating collective access is not separate from activism. It's what has to be there for activism to happen. I think about that as a success. Culturally, I talked a lot about Before Sins. I didn't write about disability. When Body Map, which is my next to last book, came out in 2015, which was a book of poetry that had all my pieces I'd written for Sins, lots of disabled art. When I went on tour with it, like a couple years before that, I'd be doing a gig and, at a college or another space, and someone would be like, oh, what do you want to do? And I'm like, oh, I want to do a disabled Black and brown queer writing workshop. And like, no one would show up. 2 people would show up. People would be apologetic. When I went on tour with Body Map, when I did that workshop, the room would be full, and it would be full of queer people of color being like, yeah, my mom's a farm worker, and I want to talk about pesticide exposure in my life and how that's manifested as chronic illness. Like, no, I want to talk about intergenerational trauma and how it plays out in PTSD and disability. There's all of these movement spaces that have been created. That's a big win. There's a group called Bad Cripple, Bay Area Disabled Something Rising in Power. I'm messing up the acronym, but it's a new disability justice political collective in the Bay Area. And my friend and comrade, the disabled Korean queer writer and activist Stacey Milburn, is a part of it. And when, one of the first times that 45 was trying to dismantle DACA, and there was a big fight back protest the day after, Stacey sent me this video, and she's like, you got to look at this moment. And I was, looking, and the video was of this, young brown speaker on the mic before the march started. First of all, she was saying, she was like, yeah, so the space at the beginning of the march is for disabled people, elders, and undocumented people. Please take your space. This is your space. I'm going to tear up. She was like, we're going to move at the pace of the slowest people. And as a disabled person who for years has ended up at the end of the march because the march moved faster than me, and it's been me and the other people in canes in the back where we just don't show up, I was like, this is a 16-year-old who gets it? Holy shit, we did it. And then Stacey was like, the Danza Azteca community, which is, indigenous Mexica dancers who often open political spaces in the Bay Area and who often burn medicines like sage and tobacco. For years, I'd seen in Black and brown movement space in the Bay, there'd been this tension between people who wanted to burn medicines, which are very important, and Black, Indigenous, and brown people whose disabilities meant that they couldn't be around fragrance, being like, oh my God, if I go to another demonstration where there's all the sage in the whole world, even that will make me sick. I've got to stay home. I feel so awful. There's a moment in that march where they were like, okay, so the Danza Azteca community is going to hold the medicine, but they're not going to burn it in order to make sure that everyone who's disabled can stay. And I was like, oh my God, not everyone's going to understand what a big deal that was. That is so many years of organizing to make that moment happen where everyone got what they needed. And where disabled, Indigenous, Black and brown people didn't have to go home or not go to the demo, and where the medicines could still be there. That's disability justice. So, yeah, I think we've got this cultural work. We've got people caring for each other. We've got people creating really creative and innovative disability justice political actions. I want to shout out one more, which is that when the wildfires happened on the West Coast this year, and I was in Seattle, and I was so sick, everyone was so sick, able-bodied people were sick, this thing happened where disabled people were the ones who, particularly people who are chemically injured or part of the multiple chemical sensitivity community, we already had the skills we needed to survive this. So all of this ash comes in, all these toxins, the air quality index is in the red or the black day after day after day. And we were like, oh, we already know about masks. We already know about respirators. We already know about detox herbs. We already know about drinking water. We already know about air filters. And we shared our disabled knowledge with all these people who are being affected. My friend Naima Niambilo once said, disabled people have already survived the end of the world. We already know how to survive the end of the world. We have skills for everybody else who's surviving it. Lightning Bolt, which is another disability justice collective in the Bay, they did an action called Masks for the People, where they're like, we're going to raise money to buy all these respirator masks and specifically get them to houseless communities of people in the Bay who don't have shelters besides tents and who are really being affected by the smoke. And we're going to get them these masks so they can get through. And I was like, fuck, we are going to save each other's lives. So this is all the good stuff. And the challenges would be, I'm in the process of writing a piece called Everybody Loves Disability Justice, Nobody Wants to Do It, which is definitely my working class central mass sarcasm. I also see us being in a movement moment where on the one hand, a lot of people, including people who don't identify as disabled, who are social justice activists, have started to get the memo. And they're like, disability justice, okay. And I also see a lot of people in social justice movement slapping disability justice on something, and they have no idea what the hell it is. And the actions are still inaccessible. They're still planning an 8-mile march. There's still no care attendance, no wheelchair access, no fragrance free, no interpreters. They're still like, oh my God, this stuff costs money. There's no way we can do that. There's still this marginalization of disabled lives, experience, skills, and needs. We want to be in leadership, and that when we're in leadership, the movement looks different. It moves slower. It moves faster in different ways. It sounds different. It walks with a limp. It's like, oh, everybody got sick, so we're going to have to reschedule. It's all this stuff. Most people are not actually able-bodied people with no commitments. Most people are elders or parents, or they're working 3 jobs, or they're sick, or they're disabled, or all of the above. And when you move at the speed of slow, you actually make room for many, many, many more people to be part of a movement.
I think this is a really nice transition into my last and my absolute favorite question that I get to ask guests.
I am for a world where survivors know that we are good at things, which is also a crip politic, where survivors know that we have incredible skills to remake the world, and we're going to do it. One thing I learned from Patty Byrne as well, where she made the simple and radical statement. She's like, disabled people are part of human existence. There's always been disabled people. We've always existed. And, the disabled Cherokee scholar and poet Coley Driscoll, I remember here saying once, in the Cherokee language pre-European colonization, there are all these words for disabled bodies, and none of them are negative. They're just different ways bodies are. So in my decolonized disability justice future, I want worlds where there is no one right or wrong way to have a body. We get to be born as all of the multiplicitous body minds that we are. I want a world where disabled, sick, and neurodivergent and deaf folks get to choose. I want a future where the abuse of disabled children is over, where medical stripping, which is a practice that still happens, where disabled young people are brought into teaching hospitals, stripped naked, and made to stand there while medical students observe their deformities. I want that to be over. I want reparations for medical abuse of Black, Brown, Indigenous disabled people. I want the survivors of the Tuskegee syphilis experiments and every other racist medical form of abuse. I want us to get compensation. And I want that repair. That could happen monetarily. That could happen so many different ways. I mean, we know that the quote unquote father of modern gynecology was a white, racist, disgusting man who performed unconsensual experiments on enslaved Black women. Those descendants deserve money and justice for that. And part of that justice is also that we recreate the health complex so that as sick, disabled, neurodivergent people, and as all people, we get exquisite medical care that is actually like looking at and listening to disabled people as resources and as experts, not just as subjects that are experimented on. Yeah, I want an end to institutionalization. The independent living movement was a movement that was created by the disability rights movement as a move to get disabled people out of where we were warehoused and locked away in jails and nursing homes and institutions. And what disability justice has said is been that is amazing. And also, many of us will never be fully independent. We need other people for care. And actually, most people need other people for care. So I wanted a future where the idea of care is decolonized from the ways in which it is seen as shameful and weak and less than, to one where we have sophisticated care economies, where everybody gets the care they need, everybody is able to offer care in ways they are able to, where we see an end to the ways in which people who are paid to care are most often Black and brown immigrant women who are paid little to nothing and who are in terrible spaces when it comes to immigration often. I want caregivers to be seen as skilled geniuses they are and to be compensated for their work. And I also want people who are caring for each other for free I want it to not just be the disabled Black and brown femmes of the world who always are I've gotten up from projectile vomiting to help somebody. And that's a beautiful thing that disabled femmes of color do. But I actually want it so that everybody actually offers care. And it's not just the feminized who remember. I think a lot about how in my dream world as a disabled artist, I would have guaranteed annual income and I would have guaranteed exquisite healthcare that I choose. And I would be able to know that I had housing, shelter, food, pleasure, to be a writer from bed, the way that I am a writer from bed. I am following into the tradition of Frida Kahlo and many other disabled queer writers and cultural workers of color in writing from my bed. And I want to be paid for that instead of what I've had to do for most of my life, which is always be hustling money and, working my ass off to scrape by. And I want that for everybody. I don't want just that for me. I want cultural work to be paid as cultural work and not in this kind of feast or famine way, but in a you get paid just the way someone who is a health professional does, just like somebody who's a project manager does. We all get paid. We all get the same amount of income. So that means an end to capitalism. That means that, Indigenous people, Black people, diasporic people of all nations get to have control of our lands, and we get to create beautiful, beautiful, accessible public transit, buildings, cultural spaces, all of it. I want a decolonized revolutionary world where we are welcomed and where we are thanked for being here. And I cannot wait for that world. And I cannot wait for the sick and disabled, neurodivergent and deaf folks who grow up in that world where they have only been known as gifts and as treasures and as being able to be complicated, imperfect people who have what we need to thrive. Yeah, that one. I want that future.
I want that future too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us and giving folks so many different ways that they can imagine otherwise.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Prasad, Rebecca Reynolds, Michelle Velasquez-Potts, and myself, Cathy Hannabach. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.